Good morning, my name is Aris Chavarria, and today I will be presenting my BA thesis in Global Studies, named the UN Sustainable Development Goal 11 in Russia, housing in Saint Petersburg, providing access to safe, adequate and affordable housing for all. My thesis supervisor is Teresa Segura Garcia, professor to whom I want to thank. The UN Sustainable Development Goal 11 is the framework of analysis for this thesis, showed in Figure 1, and more concretely the target 11.1, safe and affordable housing. This target aims to provide access to adequate, safe and affordable housing for all. The main indicator for it is the share of urban population living in slums, informal settlements and inadequate housing. This thesis offers an extensive historical background starting from the times of late Petrograd and going over the 1917 revolutions. In 1914, Petrograd was the largest city of the Russian Empire with over 2 million inhabitants. Moreover, it was the costliest of all European capitals and it had the most overcrowded apartments, with 3.3 people living per room and the majority of workers living in terrible and insalubrious conditions. At the same time, the aristocrats lived in apartments of about 200 to 300 meters in the center. Therefore, the inequalities in housing were enormous. The map of Petrograd can be seen in figure number 2. With the revolutions and the 1918 nationalization of the majority of urban housing, the worse off occupied rooms of expropriated apartments. On the other hand, the destruction triggered by World War I, the revolution and the Civil War brought Petrograd to a state of widespread deterioration and triggered migration, enrollment into the Red and the White Army, and death by hunger and disease. All in all, the population of Petrograd was reduced to a third with around 700,000 inhabitants, and Petrograd became a city of demolished buildings, collapsing water and sewage systems, and shortages of basic goods. Ironically, there was no housing shortage anymore. The situation of housing did not improve in the Soviet Union. In fact, the living space per person decreased from 1926 to 1956, and it remains unclear if the housing situation was better than in Tsarist times. Communal apartments were the rule, with several families living in single flats or even in single rooms. Stalin clearly disregarded housing and only built better housing facilities to reward the elites. Only in 1957, Nikita Khrushchev drafted the colossal housing plan to provide every household with a single flat. This housing plan was executed through the mass construction and distribution of state-built, owned and administered housing. This policy of centralized housing was continued until the late 1980s, providing with apartments to 70 million Soviet citizens. Nevertheless, this effort was not enough, and the housing shortage kept existing. Moreover, the new housing units had many deficiencies, as they were made out of cheap materials and poorly constructed. The Soviet Union was the one who paid for the construction and maintenance of housing. In Leningrad, new housing units were built in the peripheral areas, whilst in the center, most of the population occupied the old Tsarist flats, previously owned by the elites. Furthermore, the housing situation worsened due to the Leningrad siege, and communal living was perpetuating until nowadays, where around 10% of the population lives in kommunalkas, communal flats. Figure 3 displays daily situations in the kitchen of a kommunalka, where several families coexisted and carried out diverse activities. Figure 4 shows housing units made after 1957, in this case, a 5-story building made of prefabricated panels, which is popularly named Khrushchevka after the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Figure 5 exhibits a brilliant mashup by the Instagram account The Inversion of Colors, with Khrushchev holding a Khrushchev. In the late Soviet Union, Gorbachev undertook a reform for housing privatization to cope with the housing shortage. His idea was to build another 30 million housing units, giving more agency to the private sector and reducing the state budget for housing building and maintenance. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the state, with Yeltsin in power, transferred for free housing to the citizens and the municipalities, getting rid of the costs associated to housing building and maintenance. However, they did not design an appropriate strategy for this transition, and even if private property existed, there lacked a robust housing market. This was because legislation was ambiguous, the rule of law was weak, and corruption and fraud were pervasive. Nowadays, the housing shortage still exists, and there are many housing units that need to undergo reforms. Figure 6 shows a Brezhnevka, a housing unit made under the mandate of Leonid Brezhnev, a bit taller than Khrushchev. In the next section, the thesis continues with an analysis of inappropriate housing and living spaces, which are the topic of the target 11.1. In Saint Petersburg, inappropriate housing exists mainly in the form of communal flats and deteriorated buildings. Furthermore, this section focuses on homelessness as a pervasive social phenomenon. In Russia, homelessness is widespread and the government has failed to provide an accurate account of the dimension of the situation, also failing to offer a comprehensible definition of homelessness. Moreover, social stigma is prevalent and homelessness is criminalized by many. The situation in St. Petersburg is better to that in other cities thanks to the work of Nashleshka, the leading homelessness-related NGO in Russia. Daniil Kramorov, head of the Department of Resources and Public Relations, gave some insights on the situation of homelessness in Russia, explaining that the majority of homeless people are male migrant workers. Other scholars have pointed out that many women live in concealed homelessness, for example in the house of relatives or in inappropriate housing, after escaping domestic violence. Kramorov, my interviewee, also detailed the NGO's projects and explained how the authorities hinder Natalieshka's activities through administrative and bureaucratic constraints, showing the reluctance of the state to accept activity from external actors. All in all, Natalieshka covers a function that the state is disregarding. Figures 7 and 8 show one of the facilities of Natalieshka, a year-round homeless shelter in the district of Frunzensky, both in the outside in figure 7 and in the inside in figure 8. In figure 9, there is an advertisement of the AGO in a bus stop, which says, "If you have a home, stay at home." Furthermore, the thesis explored the sociological notion of the right to free housing, showing that in the Soviet Union there was a right to quasi-free housing, as there was a constitutional right to housing and the rents were very low, of about 4 to 5% of the tenant's salaries. At the same time, these low rents were used as a propaganda tool regarding higher ones in the West. The housing system was nevertheless inefficient, corrupt, and exacerbated inequalities due to the existence of a second economy for housing allocation based on contacts and unlawful activities. To test the pervasiveness of the right to free housing in the present, I conducted a survey with Russian undergraduate students of the Higher School of Economics. All in all, these students support the private housing model, which is perceived as moral, freer, and more efficient. The table 1 on the right shows the results, with only 3% of the students agreeing with the idea that the private housing model works worse than a public one, for example, in this case in point 5. Moreover, I've offered some recommendations for improving the housing situation in Russia. Starting, the authorities should end with the current aggressive foreign policy, the sanctions conflict with the West, and the current economy of war. Moreover, they should revisit and the current economic model and diversify the economy, which is actually and currently based on hydrocarbon exports. This would be good for building a more robust and less dependent economy on volatile oil prices. The share of GDP spent on military should also be cut from 4% to 2%, a similar share to that of China or India. Furthermore, the authorities should focus on enabling a wholesome housing market, drafting precise legislation, promoting independent competition, and reducing restrictions to foreign construction firms. Also, they should slash on corruption and design a system of social accountability for construction enterprises. Together with this, the authorities should implement a new hybrid housing model, letting the market act with its rules and providing funding and expertise to private endeavors, but also putting flexible caps on rent, prices, and mortgages, and providing housing for the worse off. Finally, the authorities should team up with autonomous and non-co-opted civil society groups to involve citizens in the housing projects, giving them agency in the process. To deal with homelessness, this partnership should be extended to NGOs. To end, I must say that I consider it wrong to think that housing problems are endemic to Russia. The current situation is the result of concrete political decisions, that is to say, Russia is not doomed to scarce and low-quality housing, although it has been under the rule of leaders that have had other priorities, both in Tsarist times, the Soviet Union, and post-Soviet Russia. Only Khrushchev showed substantial interest in solving the situation. Moreover, housing privatization has proved unwholesome due to the lack of a robust market for private housing. All in all, the authorities have failed to provide safe, adequate, and affordable housing for all, failing to face Target 11. Housing in Russia is an unresolved issue, and dealing with it is as pressing as ever.